Path of the Pole by Charles Hapgood, Part 9. You are listening to Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels and demons and monsters and serpents. This is Brothers of the Serpent podcast, and we are coming to you not live from the 10 by 10 by 10 tangent cube of science, where we are nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed high atop the Edwards Plateau. So we're getting back into Path of the Pole, Part 9, after that excellent episode with George Howard. He gave us lots of interesting details about the Alaskan bone beds, the possible connection of his personal cosmic tusk to that bone bed.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Good old George.
Good old George. Yeah. Hopefully we'll be seeing him here pretty soon. And, hey, we are joined by the Watcher today.
That's right. How's it going, buddy?
How's it going, Watcher?
Great to be here again. Miss a show every now and then, but always hate it. Good to be around. Can't wait to hear what comes next on the Path of the Pole. Very exciting book.
Yes, this part especially. I'm super stoked to get into this stuff that I've got marked for this episode. Some good stuff. Once we finish with the mammoths in North America, we're going to mammoths in South America. Yeah.
You better watch it good, old Watcher. I expect nothing but top quality watching from you.
What else? I had something else I was going to say, and I just completely forgot it. Oh, well.
Well,
it doesn't matter.
The studio is still a work in progress, and I still have not brought all the stuff that we need back in here, and we figure this out pretty much every time we sit down to do the show, and I'm like, damn it, and it's already like getting late, so yeah, again, I'm almost done, folks. The latest edition, I just want to say this before we get started, is thanks to Marty of the UFO series. He gave me these beautiful racks for all the gear. So they're sitting down here. You can't see them.
Yeah, but, I got equipment racks down here.
Yeah, they're great. I had all the wiring, all the wires are like rolled up and zip tied and everything all on the back of that thing. It's awesome. I don't ever have to get into the back of this unit because all the inputs are hooked up. The cables are right there on the floor. I know where everything is. I got a big power button that turns on all the speakers and everything all at once. It's awesome. Thanks, buddy.
And then something will happen, and you'll have to tear the hull out and rewire everything. it'll be a bird's nest again.
No way. That's not happening, folks.
Yeah, we're also looking at getting other camera setups.
Yeah.
Right now we'll just go with this one over the monitor, but
too many people were confused
by two cameras. Yeah, apparently that's confusing.
I thought, well, the two cameras are next to each other, and then I guess people with like spatial awareness issues couldn't make sense of the room. Like, I thought it was a cube, but the walls look like they're at odd angles. Yeah. So then I was like, well, we could stack the videos on top of each other, but then I was like, they'll be like, is it a 2-story building?
Yeah.
Good grief, people. Sorry about the confusion.
I mean, the instant you go with video, you start getting these questions.
Yeah. I know.
What are you wearing? What is that thing in the background? Like, we're talking about pyramids and mammoths and stuff, and they're like, what is that thing on the table?
I'm just going to wear a butt flap. So it's just we won't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the new show outfit is just butt flaps.
Butt flaps. Pantsless and dead. All right. So, Hapgood says, the theory that mammoths may have been preserved by falls into pits or into rivers encounters further objections. So you remember before he was saying a lot of people were trying to explain the preservation of these things by like, well, it randomly falls into a crevasse, right? So this theory encounters further objections. Tolmachev, a Russian authority, pointed out that the remains are often found at high points, on the highest points of the tundra. He notes that the bodies are found in frozen ground, not in ice, and that they must have been buried in mud before freezing. This presents a serious problem because, he says, quote, as a matter of fact, the swamps and bogs of a moderate climate, with their treacherous pits in northern Siberia, owing to the permanently frozen ground, could exist only in quite exceptional conditions, unquote. And Howarth remarked on this same problem, quote, while it is on the one hand clear that the ground in which the bodies are found has been hard frozen since the carcasses were entombed, it is no less inevitable that when these same carcasses were originally entombed, the ground must have been soft and unfrozen. You cannot thrust flesh into hard frozen earth without destroying it, unquote. Since Tolmachev can think of no other solution to this problem, he finds himself forced to conclude that the mammoths got trapped in mud when feeding on river terraces. And we have seen that this conflicts seriously with the conditions of temperature required for the preservation of the meat, whether they were feeding on the terraces during the summer, when presumably the fresh grass supply would be available there, or whether they were shoving aside the heavy snowdrifts during winter to attempt to get at the dead grass below. In either case, they would fall into unfrozen water, the temperature of which could not be lower than 32 degrees Fahrenheit.
Well, maybe it could be lower because it's moving.
Yeah.
So it actually could be below freezing, but because it's in motion, it's just not ice.
Right.
That's what I was thinking.
Salt water also can get colder too, right?
For sure, yeah.
Of course, we're talking about rivers.
But that's what occurred to me was that if these floods were caused by, supra and subglacial flows, all from, off of these glaciers, that water's going to be really freaking cold.
Yeah.
Even though it, if it was flash melted by an impact or whatever it was melted by, it still has to run in all this ice.
Yep.
And you know what happens when you, like a shaker for a mixed drink or whatever, you put ice in the water, you shake it up, and it
gets cold.
It gets really freaking cold.
Yeah.
So those floodwaters could have been what got the animal down to basically the threshold of frozen.
Yeah.
Then it's entrained in all this mud that was also cooled by the flowing water. That seems a little more acceptable, that it's like, at least you're refrigerating the thing before, right? It's not going from like room temperature being buried under 60 feet of mud, because that would seem to take way too long to get it frozen under.
But the animals, because they're mammals, start out at whatever body heat.
But if they're in the flood, for
and
a
they're
while,
dead, yes,
and then
they get disarticulated, most of them,
yeah. Okay. Next mystery. He says the watcher says impure water has a lower freezing point.
Not by a huge amount, but still, yeah.
Impure.
Okay, so furthermore, if this is the way it happened, why are the animals often found on the highest points of the tundra?
What do you mean? Like highest in elevation?
The water's going to be the lowest points, whatever the water. But these animals are found up high where the water doesn't flow, in other words. But,
how is it in muck?
Flood. I don't know. Mud. Thus, we see that the further we get into this question, the thornier it becomes. We shall have, for one thing, to face the problem of the apparently sudden original freeze. How sudden, indeed, must it have been? How can we account for it on the assumption of a comparatively slow displacement of the Earth's crust? So far as the first question is concerned, recent research has contributed interesting new data. Research on the mechanics of the freezing process and its effects on animal tissues has been carried forward considerably since the experiments conducted by Birdseye's engineers. In an article in Science, Merriman summarizes the more recent findings. These are based on extremely thorough laboratory research, and they modify, to some extent, the Birdseye findings. Merriman shows that initial freezing at deep temperatures is not required for the preservation of meat. On the contrary, such sudden deep freeze may destroy the cells. He remarks, Lovelock considers 5C as the lowest temperature to which mammalian cells may be slowly frozen and still survive. Furthermore, the tissues survive gradual freezing very well. In most, if not all, soft tissue cells, there is no gross membrane rupture by slow freezing. Even though it is frozen for long periods of time, upon thawing, the water is re-imbibed by the cells and their immediate histological appearance is often indistinguishable from the normal. It appears that what damages the cells is dehydration, caused by the withdrawal of water from them to be incorporated in the ice. This process goes on after the initial freezing. Quote, "The principal cause of injury from slow freezing is not the physical presence of extracellular ice crystals, but the denaturation incurred by the dehydration resulting from the incorporation of all free water into ice," unquote. So I think, didn't we have a discussion about this?
We did, and the watcher looked into it further, I know.
Yeah. Because people were talking about cryogenically freezing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this guy is basically saying, if you do it slowly, then you're okay. Because the cells have time for the water to remove, to leave the cell walls and then turn into ice crystals. So there are only two known ways, according to Merriman, to prevent this damage. First, the temperature may be reduced immediately after freezing to very low, stabilizing temperatures. The other way is artificial. It consists of using glycerin to bind water in the liquid state, preventing it from freezing. Merriman shows that once the temperature has fallen to a very low point, it must remain at that point if the frozen product is to escape serious damage. The reason for this is that, except at these low temperatures, a recrystallization process may take place in ice in which numerous small crystals are combined into large ones, and the growth of the large crystals disrupts cells and membranes. He remarks, "At very low temperatures, recrystallization is relatively slow, and equilibrium is approached while the crystals are quite small. At temperatures near the melting point, recrystallization is rapid, and the crystals may grow to nearly visible size in less than an hour." So I am reminded in writing these lines of my experience in truck gardening. In trying to reduce damage from frost, I often resorted to a method that was effective but mysterious, for I could not understand why it worked. I learned that if the vegetables got frosted, even heavily frosted, they would not be seriously damaged if I could manage to get out before sunrise and thoroughly hose them off, washing away the frost. If, however, the sun should rise before I was finished, the unwashed vegetables would be damaged. It would seem, according to the explanations given by Merriman, that the frost damage was the result of recrystallization of the ice that had formed within the vegetable fibers. Small crystals growing into large ones in the hour or so before the sun was up far enough to melt them may have caused the damage. So it follows from this analysis of the mechanics of freezing that the preservation of mammoth meat for thousands of years may be accounted for by normal initial freezing followed by a sharp fall in temperature. Whenever the meat was preserved in an edible condition, the deep freeze must have been uninterrupted. There must have been no thaws sufficient to bring the temperature near the freezing point.
That's crazy to think. They've been frozen
So
deeply that long.
Yeah, so clearly that didn't always happen because there's some, some of these Pleistocene animal meats that have been recovered that are they're not good.
Yeah,
but in other cases, it is good enough to eat, so such that scavengers will actually feed on it.
Right.
So let us now take a closer look at one of the preserved mammoths and see what it may have to tell us. The Beresovka mammoth. So perhaps the most famous individual mammoth found preserved in the permafrost was the so-called Beresovka mammoth. This mammoth was discovered sticking out of the ground not far from the bank of the Beresovka River in Siberia about 1901. Word of it reached the capital, St. Petersburg. It so happened that a long time before, word of another mammoth had come to the ears of Tsar Peter the Great. With his strong interest in natural science, the Tsar had issued an order that whenever thereafter another mammoth was discovered, an expedition should be sent out by his Imperial Academy of Sciences to study it. In accordance with this standing order, a group of distinguished academicians entrained at St. Petersburg and proceeded to the remote district of Siberia where the creature had been reported. When they arrived, they found that the wolves had chewed off such parts of the mammoth as projected above ground, but most of the carcass was still intact. They erected a structure over the body and built fires so as to thaw the ground and permit the removal of the remains. This process was hardly agreeable since the moment the meat began to thaw, the stench became terrific. However, several academicians remarked that after a little exposure to the stench, they became used to it and they ended by hardly noticing it. Eventually, the body of the entire mammoth was removed from the ground. The academics, meantime, made careful observations of its original position. They saw evidence that, in their opinion, the mammoth had been mired in the mud. It looked as if its last struggles had been to get out of the mud, and as if it had frozen to death in a half-standing position. Strangely enough, the animal's penis was fully erect. 2 major bones, a leg bone and the pelvic bone, had been broken as if by a fall. There was still some food on the animal's tongue and between his teeth, indicating an abrupt interruption of his last meal. The preliminary conclusion suggested by these facts was that the animal met his death by falling into the river. Very special interest attached to the analysis of the contents.
That broke his back legs, like.
Right. Yeah, I don't know.
I guess it depends on how. I mean, yeah, if he fell from like way up above the river,
yeah,
into a shallow river,
right.
I don't know. That's weird.
It is strange. So, very special interest attached to the analysis of the contents of this animal's stomach. These consisted of about 50 pounds of material, largely undigested. 50 pounds.
50?
50.
As if it was one.
Largely undigested and remarkably well preserved. While the foregoing data were obtained from a translation of parts of the report of the academics published by the Smithsonian Institution, the section dealing with the stomach contents was specially translated for this work by my aunt, Mrs. Norman Hapgood. Since there are many interesting points essential to an understanding of the question, which can be noted only by a reading of the report itself and which do not figure in the published accounts, I reproduce the stomach analysis by V.N. Sukachev, with omissions of technical botanical terms where possible, and with omission of bibliographical references to Russian, German, and Latin sources, and some shortening of the comment. But we can definitely establish the following types of plants in the food in the stomach, and among the teeth of the Beresovka mammoth. All right, so there's a bunch of Latin names here. So, Alopicurus alpinus sin. The remains of this grass are numerous in the contents of the stomach. A significant portion of it consists of stems with occasional remnants of leaves, usually mixed in with other vegetable remains. All of these remains are so little destroyed that one is able to establish with exactitude to what species they belong. Measurements of the individual parts of these plants, when compared with the varieties of the existing species, showed that the variety contained in the food was more closely related to that now found in the forest regions to the south of the tundra than to the varieties now found in the tundra. Nevertheless, this is an Arctic variety and is widely spread over the Arctic regions in North America and Eurasia. However, in the forested region, it runs far to the south. B. Beckmannia eruciformis. The florets of this plant are numerous in the contents of the stomach and usually are excellently preserved. The detailed description of the remains with the precise measurement in millimeters shows the species to be the same as that of the present day, although a little smaller, which may be the result of compaction in the stomach. At the present time, the species is widely prevalent in Siberia and in the Arctic generally. It grows in flooded meadows or marshes. It is also found in North America, south of Europe, and a major part of European Russia. In almost all of Siberia, Japan, North China, and Mongolia. C. Agropyrum cristatum. Remains of this plant are very numerous in the contents of the stomach. They are so well preserved that there is no doubt as to the exact species. The individual specimens are slightly smaller than those of the typical more southern variety growing today, but this could be the result of some reduction of size because of pressure in the stomach, which is noted in other cases. So a lot of times he's noting that they're smaller, and I kept thinking of the atmospheric CO2. I wonder if that has something to do with the size of these plants. They're much smaller at the time than they are in modern times when we have, much higher CO2 in the atmosphere.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Because during the Ice Age, it would have been much lower.
Yeah, very low.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm like, what kind of pressure in the stomach? That's weird. It's not much.
Yeah, I don't know what they're talking about with the compaction. Like, the flower is small. I don't know if that's due to compaction, but of course, we don't know what the remains look like. They were clearly, they're chewed up. So the finding of these plants is of great interest. Not only are they scarcely known anywhere in the Arctic regions, they are even, so far as I've been able to discover, very rare also in the Yakutsk district. Generally speaking, The Agropyrum cristatum is a plant of the plains, or the steppes, and is widespread in the plains of Daria. The general range of this plant includes southern Europe and European Russia, southern Siberia, Turkestan, Jungaria, Tiahuanaco, and Mongolia. Nevertheless, the variety found in the stomach differs slightly from both the European and Oriental Siberian varieties found today. So in other words, they're finding extinct plants as well. Okay, so the next plant was Hordeum violaceum. Our specimens are in no particularly different from the specimens of this species. This plant is apparently no longer found along the Lena River, except south of its junction with the Alden River. It's found in dry and grassy areas. It is not found in the Arctic regions. So I'll skip some of this, but basically they go through and they exhaustively list all the plants found, and there's a bunch of them. Quite a few of them are extinct. In general, the ranges of these plants do not include up in the Arctic.
Yeah.
Okay. So in addition to the 9 species mentioned above and described in the report with numerous measurements, the author reports that 2 kinds of mosses were identified in the stomach contents. There were 5 sprigs of Hypnum fluitans, and which is dill, and 1 sprig of something else.
Cucumber.
Alicomnium turgidum.
Is a big pickle fan.
The first is common in Siberia north of the 61st parallel of latitude and to the marshlands of northern Europe. Both of them belong to species widely distributed over both the wooded and the tundra regions. The report states further that another scientist brought back several fragments of woody substances and bark from beneath the mammoth, and of the species of vegetation among which it was lying. Very surprisingly, these were found to differ in a marked degree from the contents of the stomach.
Yeah, but wouldn't that be the case if he was in, like, if he was in muck? Like, if it was flood deposits? I mean, it's just going to have everything in it.
Yeah.
Everything from wherever that flood came from.
Right. And at the time, so it's clear that these scientists who were initially looking at this were not thinking that this mammoth was deposited by any kind of catastrophe, except a personal one to it.
Right, yeah.
Like it fell, right? It landed on stuff that was there, and so they took samples of what it landed on. That's how they were thinking about it.
Which could be, I mean, but he had to be buried somehow.
Yeah, that's right.
And not scavenged.
Yes. Yeah, so well preserved that it must have been buried. And what does it take to bury a whole mammoth?
Yeah.
In a sitting position. It's not laying down on its side.
Right, that's so weird.
So another tree identified in a general way was Betula alba, but the exact species could not be determined. The same was true of a third tree, Alnus. All 3 of these kinds grow at present in the Kolyma River Basin along the Beresovka, and they are widespread in general from the northern limits of the wooded belt to the southern plains. So the general conclusions reached in the report are as follows. The remains of plants in the mammoth's mouth between its teeth were the same as the stomach contents and represented food the mammoth had not yet swallowed when it was killed. The food consisted preponderantly of grasses and sedge. No remains at all of conifers were found. Therefore, one may conclude that the Beresovka mammoth did not, as was previously thought, feed mainly on coniferous vegetation, but mainly on meadow grasses. Evidently, he wandered into low, moist places and also into higher, drier places, such as are now found in the same region. The finding of the wood remains under the mammoth, and even the cliff itself where the mammoth was lying, suggests that he was not feeding in the place where he died. The majority of the vegetation in his food did not grow along cliffs or in conjunction with these species of trees.
So he was next to a cliff then. That's why they thought he just fell.
Yeah, maybe.
And maybe he did, if he fell off a cliff.
Yeah. The discovery of ripe fruits of sedges, grasses, and other plants suggests the mammoth died during the second half of July or the beginning of August.
Wow. God, that's crazy.
Okay, so Watcher, did you have some stuff to say about the death here? You want to come on?
Yeah, so a thing that an EMT or someone who works in emergency medicine would know that Hapgood probably wouldn't is that a telltale sign of a cervical spine injury, like a severed spine at the neck, is an erection. priapism. It has to do with the changing in the balance of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system.
We also heard that it's asphyxiation can cause it.
Yeah.
Yes. So the thing that he says is like the strangeness of the mammoth's penis being erect. What that indicates is that whatever happened probably crushed its spine and did damage to the spinal column, but didn't necessarily kill it. So if it's below the fifth or sixth cervical vertebrae, the lungs are still working, but you have no motion. All the limbs are dead. And so you would have, that's indicative of a traumatic spine injury.
Okay. I think they would have noted that if it had crushed vertebrae. Right? They're saying its pelvis is broken, leg bone and pelvic bone. In other words, they went through the bone. It says 2 major bones, the leg bone and the pelvic bone, have been broken as if by a fall. But it doesn't say anything about a spinal injury.
I mean, the spine in theory could be intact. If you have a fall, you could still sever the spine from pressure between the bones.
Or the spinal cord could be severely damaged.
Yeah.
Right.
But not an actual broken bone.
But asphyxiation, I mean, he was buried too. So
yeah.
Also true.
Something buried him. And that could have, he could have been alive when he was covered.
Yeah, when we went over this...
We went over this with Randall.
The idea is that something slammed it onto its haunches and broke its legs and its pelvis.
Was this the same one or a different one where the
feet were sheared off?
Yeah.
That's a different one.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like a foot in the mud, like in a footprint, right? But it's sheared off and the animal's body and legs are like backwards away from the foot, or away from, I guess, 2 of the hind feet or something like that. Like something really
blew it off of its own feet that stayed stuck in the the muck. Yeah. So I kind of this is not in here, but I kind of identify this with a blast. It seems like blast damage. Something, a pressure wave goes past it. Yeah. Knocks all of the air out of its lungs.
Or maybe did knock it off the cliff.
It could have knocked it off the cliff.
And then the cliff collapses or dirt on the cliff and stuff.
Yeah, and bury it instantly. Yeah. But then it has to be frozen. It's crazy.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. That's what I'm saying. Like, how did that food not putrefy?
Yeah.
So it had to be, that's what I keep thinking. I'm like, it had to be buried in almost frozen mud.
Yeah. Well, clearly the area that it was in was not tundra at the time, right? But it was cold.
Yeah.
But it's still it's a cool climate, but it's also the middle of summer. So yeah, whatever happens, and I think you brought this up too, like it whatever happens that makes it cold doesn't have to just freeze the mammoth, it has to freeze all the material that it's in. That's what I mean,
yeah.
And it basically, if it gets covered by 60 feet of stuff, now it's insulated from the cold at the surface.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it has to be frozen first and then covered. But if it was covered in warm material, it would thaw it.
Yeah.
And then you would see all the cell destruction, all that kind of stuff.
That's right.
So
it's such a strange, I start thinking of like weird, I mean, this gets woo, but I start thinking of like weird electromagnetic
electric universe.
Yeah, like something is cooling it down anomalously. I don't know. I guess you could have, like you were saying, a bunch of basically glacial water.
I mean, that's an interesting idea. It's like some kind of thermoelectric effect.
Yeah.
Where one side of the planet like starts burning and then the other side freezes.
Yeah.
Somehow. I don't know.
I think your explanation,
you guys, you electric universe people need to look into this.
Yeah.
Can the Earth become a thermoelectric, whatever it's called?
I don't know.
Transducer?
Yeah. I think your explanation is better though, like that you may have impacts or air bursts above the ice, but all this water comes rushing out and the water is basically at freezing or below it, a little bit below it. It's not going to be above it.
Think about the temperatures in the Arctic, right? If you flash melt, like, I don't know what it is, how far below freezing is it, like near, way up on these ice sheets?
Yeah.
Way down there.
It can be 60 below,
so
70
something
below.
flash melts some water and cracks the ice, and that water gets moving.
Yeah.
It's going to be really hard to freeze it, but it's going to start dropping in temperature.
Yeah.
As it's going through all this ice, but it's got all this inertia, it's got all this energy. So it could possibly get way below freezing and be taking sediments with it that have been sitting under the freaking ice for however many thousands of years.
Yeah.
So it's basically frozen mud that has so much, kinetic energy?
It can also be under pressure under all that ice too. So would that keep it from freezing as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But of
so if
course,
you
by the
pressure-
time it gets to the mammoth, it's not under ice, right? It's going to be. It's not going to be under.
It's
a
not gonna be
glacier
under
anymore.
pressure.
Yeah. But it can be very cold, mixed with a bunch of stuff. And yeah, I guess if it's muddy,
that's the
water,
other thing is
if
if
it's
it-
muddy water, it can be really cold and not freeze, right?
Yeah.
If it's got all this suspended sediments in it, that
Yeah.
would maybe keep it from freezing. I don't know.
That's what I'm thinking. But still, then you're trying to imagine this animal in this upright position getting hit with this flood.
Yeah. It shouldn't leave it upright. Yeah.
It would take it and so maybe it was slow moving at that point or something. And he just gets buried in silt in a couple of days because it's like he goes underwater. And then the sediment in the water just drops all the sticks and leaves and muck and whatever that's basically almost frozen already.
Yeah. So, yes. So,
I don't know. It's so weird.
and like another possibility is that he dies on the surface and gets frozen, flash frozen before getting buried.
Yeah.
And then all the stuff comes in and covers him. And
That's what I was
And
trying
it's
to say.
almost- yeah.
That stuff would already have to be basically frozen. Otherwise, it would thaw him.
thaw him out. Yeah. Yeah.
So no matter what, you're dealing with the sediment that buries him has to be basically below freezing.
Yeah. And based on the preservation of its material and the lab work that we were reading about earlier, that you need to get it really far below freezing. Like once you slowly
Yeah.
freeze it, initially you slowly freeze it, and then you need to drop it way down and then keep it there forever.
Keep going, yeah.
Yeah. It's so strange.
Yeah.
I don't
It's
know.
basically this is a blender scenario.
Yeah,
but
it's a blender scenario, but it's also one of these perfect
Really
impossible
slow moving.
puzzles.
it's blending everything else, but not the mammoth.
Right.
What? Yeah, this is weird. All right. We'll think about that during the break and come back with no better ideas than we had when we left.
No, yeah. Still impossible.
And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, Brothers of the Serpent podcast. Continuing on with Path of the Pole. And,
Still not understanding what's going on.
yeah, dealing with this enigma
Yes.
of crazy frozen circumstances.
So this next section is called the interpretation of the report. And this is what I was talking about in the last, in part 8, where I was saying that Hapgood finds out how old this mammoth is and it throws a wrench in the works for his ideas. So he says a vital prerequisite for any correct interpretation of the facts in this case is information on the age of the mammoth. This information was not available when the first edition of this work went to press, but it is now at hand. It comes as a great surprise to those like myself who assumed that the mammoth must have died during the time that Siberia was moving northward in accordance with the crust displacement hypothesis. That is, between approximately 12,000 and 18,000 years ago. The age of the mammoth, however, turns out to be at least 39,000 years, possibly as much as 47,500 years.
Wow.
So even setting aside the problem that presents to him for his crust displacement theory, the possibility that this mammoth was perfectly preserved for 40,000 years without putrefied to the point to where wolves were eating it when it came out of it just doesn't make any sense.
Is this one of the ones that the scavengers were eating?
Yeah.
Oh.
The wolves were eating it when they went to study it.
Okay. Wow.
So this, and again, when we discussed this with Randall a long time ago on Cosmography and we were going over these details, he was saying that in some cases it seems like maybe these cosmogenic events throw the dating somehow, because
carbon-14.
how can you expect, I don't know. Can you really preserve something that well just out in the open for 40,000 years?
It was buried.
Yeah, I mean, out in nature. Like, in other words, it's not in a freezer, right? It's not in a controlled environment. It's just out there. Just, it seems...
Well, I mean...
maybe it's possible.
Like, how long have, say, like some of the mountain glaciers in Antarctica been there?
Yeah, like a million years.
And so there's, like...
Is there going to be any degradation of flesh frozen in them for a million years? Is it going to degrade in some way slowly?
Yeah, it just depends, I guess. I mean, I don't know.
It just seems nuts,
Yeah,
there was not a single anomalously warm summer for that entire period.
Depends on how deep it was.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if let's say it was...
It got washed out of the bank of a river, didn't it? I mean, so the river basically chewed into the area where it was. And
so if it was way underneath all this sediment that's been basically frozen down that low, if it did have a few years of thawing up above, at the top...
It won't thaw down deep enough to thaw it out. Just seems crazy.
You'd have to have... Yeah, I know. I agree. But it does present an issue for the pole shift hypothesis.
Yeah.
Or crustal shift hypothesis.
Yeah.
That if that's the driver, then you have to...
It's also a weirdness for the impact hypothesis. It's, you've got these problems where they're finding mammoth parts with proxies in them, but the dates on the bones are really old. Like, well, not really old, but they're much older than the Younger Dryas. So now you're having to say, well, this happens a bunch.
Yeah.
That these mammoths were killed 30,000 years ago by this impact and 40,000 years ago by an impact because they have proxies.
Yeah, I wonder if is it possible that these ice ages that we're familiar with in the records are all caused by a sort of sustained bombardment over however many tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
Like you get into a busy traffic, right?
Yeah, and then you just end up with a lot of dust in the atmosphere and everything gets cold. You get a nuclear winter effect. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
Not like it has to happen every year, but if it's happening every couple of thousand years, or maybe every 10,000 years, you're just keeping the environment in that sort of stasis.
Yeah.
Or you have a brief, you have regional areas that get this crazy flash melting but it causes all this other mayhem that ends up making it more cold.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So Hapgood says, where does this leave us? Can we fit this into our scheme? It appears from this timing, which there is no reason to doubt, that the Beresovka mammoth died when the climate in Siberia was warming up, after the pole had left the Greenland Sea and migrated to America. His death occurred at a time when we would assume that there was a high turbulence of climatic conditions, and when the level of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions would be at a peak. Since the warming of the climate had probably been going on for several thousand years, herds of mammoths and other animals would have been moving northward into areas where the grasslands and forests had been reestablished. And it was in the middle of this warming trend in Siberia, when the climate was warmer there than it is now, and right in the middle of summer that the mammoth died and his body was immediately frozen. And somehow or other, it remained frozen all through the period of about 30,000 years, when we have shown through much evidence that the Arctic Ocean was warm and luxuriant forests were growing along the Arctic coasts.
During that same time.
Yeah, so what he's saying here is like, even if you just set aside the crustal shift, he's presented all this evidence showing the Arctic Ocean was warm and there were forests growing where this mammoth died for a long time. So it wasn't like,
Yeah, so maybe the dates are wrong.
Right. But he says there's no reason to doubt the dates. That's what he says. I disagree with that. But
I mean, that's a reason right there. The surround, like if you have all of this other evidence that there at the same period that this thing was frozen solid, there was temperate climates. So that's a reason to doubt the dates.
But how are they dating the time of the warm Arctic Ocean? And, that's what I'm saying. It's like, are we doubting a date of one thing, but not the dates of another for the same period?
Yeah, it would be, how, if you're taking all these dates or you're dating all this material, what is the ratio of things with these much older dates?
Yeah.
And then the younger dates.
Yeah.
But they would have to be juxtaposed. In other words, like things with younger dates, if they were all living like trees and things that shouldn't be there if it was cold.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
The evidence for the warm Arctic that we have presented in earlier chapters is overwhelming, and it ties in with the evidence we have produced for a warm Antarctic at the same time. It cannot be dismissed just because one mammoth and a few other animals, see the table below, wanted to stay frozen for the whole period that the Arctic was warm. But it certainly is not easy to see how those bodies could have been kept in deep freeze for such a length of time when the climate of the region where they lay entombed was warm. Offhand, one would be tempted to shout that the thing was impossible. Of course, there has to be a way out. 3 or 4 bodies are not going to bulldoze us into giving up the assumption of the warm Arctic that is supported by so much evidence. But if we are going to hold to our assumption of a warm Arctic, how are we going to explain the Beresovka mammoth? Perhaps we can do it this way. The evidence shows that the animal suffered a very severe fall, severe enough to break his pelvis and leg. We learn also that the food in his stomach and mouth did not match the vegetation around him at the spot where he was found. He did not fall into water because, as was ascertained by another investigator, large masses of his blood were found under him.
Oh, man.
So there's a huge pool of blood directly beneath where... So that's where he fell.
Yeah.
Basically. I mean, maybe he could have been moved and bled somewhere else, but, basically, he bled out there.
Yeah.
The blood would, of course, have been washed away had he tumbled into a river. The fact that his penis was found to be erect indicates that he was not instantly killed by his fall, but that he froze to death. He was certainly plunged suddenly into extreme cold. I think we can see how this might have happened. With a high level of earthquake activity, large fissures could be opening in the crust in considerable numbers as they commonly do in many earthquakes. Let us assume that the mammoth fell into one of these. We must remember that according to our theory, a long period of intense cold had gripped the Siberian coast until only a short while before. This would have been the time of the pole position in the Greenland Sea. The situation of the pole just north of Norway would have logically involved an ice age in the region of the Beresovka River. The frozen ground or permafrost of this ice age might have extended down thousands of feet, as it does today in some places in the Arctic. When the pole moved to Hudson Bay, the climate in the Beresovka region would have become about like that of Minnesota today, where the winters are severe enough to prevent or greatly delay the deep melting of a permafrost extending down thousands of feet. So we may suggest then that the Beresovka mammoth fell into a deep crevasse or fracture in the Earth's crust, perhaps several hundreds of feet deep. He might have tumbled down a sloping wall of the crevasse a long way without actually killing himself. But of course, at the bottom, loose earth dislodged by his fall could have cascaded down upon him and buried him alive. According to biologists I have consulted, the erection of the penis could have resulted from the poor animal's emotions of terror and from his pain. The mammoth might have been frozen to death and afterwards been gradually frozen through in the manner I have suggested in the preceding pages. The fissure would very likely have been largely filled in as the result of continuing earth shocks, landslides, and the like, and then gradually the temperature of the body would have been reduced to the low temperatures prevailing deep in the permafrost. And what of that great fissure? What is the existing evidence of it? Why, the valley of the Beresovka River itself. The valley or channel of the present river may have been created by the filling in of the fissure. But how then, you may ask, did the mammoth come to the surface? The answer may be that erosion in the valley was rapid during the ensuing warm period, because the river must have been much better fed by its tributaries than it is now. Moreover, Moreover, it is generally thought that the coast stood higher then than now, so that the New Siberian and Lyakov Islands were connected with the mainland. The result of these factors would probably have been that the river was much larger and flowed much faster than now, and consequently in the 30,000 years or so of the warm period could have eroded the valley to a very considerable depth. The Beresovka mammoth and the other bodies we have of about the same age might thus have been brought nearer the surface, but not actually uncovered until after the climate again grew cold with another poleward shift of Siberia. So the following table shows that warming periods after glaciations, that is, after crust displacements, have been just as fatal to species of animals as periods of increasing cold. I feel that this is because they succumbed to the turbulence of the climate, to the furious storms, to the abrupt changes of temperature caused by massive volcanism, to hurricanes, dust storms, torrential rains, and unseasonable snows that probably decimated their food supplies. In America, after all, the horse, mastodon, mammoth, and other Ice Age animals died out as the climate was warming up. We shall see in the next chapter that cold climate has nothing whatever to do with the massive extinctions of animals in South America at the same time. Of course, most of the animals found frozen in the Arctic do date, as Table 20 shows, from the end of the Wisconsin glaciation to the time when we assume Siberia was moving northward, and the refrigeration of the climate does account for the good preservation of the mammoth ivory. At the same time, the turbulence of the climatic conditions accounts for the fact that few entire bodies are found. The remains are for the most part just bones, scattered about and piled in great heaps, together with heaps of frozen trees. These contribute an air of violence and tragedy to the endless reaches of the desolate tundra.
God. Man, that's...
So yeah, in this table he was discussing, he just shows a bunch of different animals, the dates that they were found dead. Lots of them, like he said, are into the Younger Dryas. Some of them are beginning, and then some of them are much earlier.
Yeah. So I was thinking about, I was asking the watcher, aren't there like ice caves in warm climates?
Yeah, you're right.
So
I mean, there's ice caves in like New Mexico.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Yeah.
But then he brought up the permafrost. And so then I just never have thought about this, but is there, like, can there be soils on the ground and grasses and trees growing in warmer climates, but it's just frozen solid for 100 feet down in this topsoil?
I think especially with his ideas, because he's saying that you basically have something that's on the pole. And so it gets this 1,000-foot thick,
just frozen.
Everything's
earth.
frozen. And then that moves southward. It takes a long time for the warmth of the surface to move downward. So he's saying maybe, if this mammoth fell hundreds of feet into a crack caused by an earthquake.
So is he suggesting
in Siberia that didn't move far enough south to completely melt the permafrost all the way down, and then eventually Siberia moves back north, so it stays frozen until modern times.
So was he earlier? I can't remember because it's been a while since we started this. But was he suggesting that Greenland used to be, or like that area used to be up at the pole, and now it's moved south, but it's still frozen?
Yeah, the Greenland. It was that the pole was in the Greenland Sea before the Hudson Bay pole.
Yeah.
That would be the 40,000 year ago pole. That's what he's saying. He's saying that according to his ideas and the dates he's given for pole shifts, that this mammoth died in the transition from the Greenland Sea to the Hudson Bay pole. When Siberia was, warmer up.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I mean, when I read it, I was like, okay, you gave all this stuff for like, well, they didn't fall into cracks in the earth.
Yeah.
And then your explanation is like, well, maybe this one actually did fall into a crack in the earth, because how else can we explain this? But that mammoth is extraordinary because it is anomalous. It's found intact, unlike the vast majority of these Pleistocene animals that are found just in pieces.
It does make sense that it fell into a crack. And if there was permafrost, then it's frozen down there.
Right. So you have huge earthquakes. It
Yeah.
splits open the earth. The top maybe 5 or 10 feet of are warm and have grasses and other thing. It splits it open, but deep down in there you have
freezing cold.
this previous Arctic,
So he falls down in there with some rubble, and and a lot of the rubble is going to be cold.
Yeah.
Man,
It seems like I don't know. It seems like a very complicated explanation. Yeah. But how else do you explain it? Even without pole shifts, how are you going to explain this thing?
Yeah.
I mean,
40, that's a pretty damn good explanation. If that's just, I just don't know how the permafrost, how is that something that exists today where you just get this, you'll have forests on top of, and then if you dig down, it's just frozen.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because, forests take a while to get there.
Yeah.
Unless they're planted. Then you can expect a decent forest in a couple generations or whatever. But I mean, to naturally appear, you know what I mean? That takes a while.
100 years at least, right? Before any trees will start growing. But until you get a forest, I mean, the trees could be little, they could be tiny, but until you get a proper.
Yeah.
If you start out with nothing, like where the ice melts and now you just have bare ground.
Yeah.
It's
gravel and all that.
Yeah, it's going to be a while before you get a forest there.
Yeah. That's what I'm talking about.
I was thinking like 50 or 100 years is probably what it's going to be before you have a proper forest.
So you get that forest. This is what I'm asking, if there's a modern analog for this.
And down below that, it's got frozen ground.
You go to some forest up north and you dig down and it's just frozen solid way down there.
Yeah, I don't know. The watcher is showing us a map of locations of ice caves in the U.S.
Well, yeah. Hey, there's some in Texas.
He says, ignore the one in Texas.
Oh. Oh, that's a restaurant.
Caves Ice Cream. No.
Yeah, New Mexico, Ice Cave Canyon.
That's probably up in the mountains.
Duck Creek Ice Cave.
Yeah.
Hey.
We should go check
We
that
need to
out.
go check that out.
But yeah, Duck Creek is at 9,000 feet. That's So it's going to be, it's cold up there. I mean, we were, yes.
But there's still forests.
Yeah, there are forests. Yeah.
And, and nearby, you can walk down the mountain and it's way warmer. So you can have an animal that might have a long range.
Yeah.
Who's eating something, and then later that day, he's up in the ice.
Yeah. Yep.
So that could be another factor here.
Could be.
That we just don't know the geography.
They said that the researchers did say that it was, even though they at first they state it seems that it was killed in the middle of eating. Later they say clearly it wasn't killed where it was eating. Right. How long do mammoths have stuff stuck between their teeth? That's basically the question. Like, does it ever floss? Probably not.
Identifiable stuff. That's
yeah. All right. Part 7. Storm. I have referred to the possibility that the extinction of animals and preservation of their bodies may be accounted for in part by violent atmospheric disturbances. And I have offered some evidence that such disturbances did accompany the last displacement of the crust and therefore presumably earlier displacements. It may be hard to distinguish between the effects on animal life of ice action, that is, of being melted out of glaciers and subjected to the action of glacial streams, and the effects of atmospheric factors. Nevertheless, perhaps some evidence of the operation of the atmospheric factors is available. The evidence is presented in part by Professor Frank C. Hibben in The Lost Americans. This is a book that's been referenced multiple times by Randall and other people. George talked about it. And since his description of the evidence is firsthand and is presented so clearly, I have asked his permission to reproduce the pertinent passages. He begins with a general description of the Alaskan muck, in which enormous quantities of bones and even parts of bodies are found. Quote, in many places, the Alaskan muck is packed with animal bones and debris in trainload lots. Bones of mammoth, mastodon, several kinds of bison, horses, wolves, bears, and lions tell a story of a faunal population. The Alaskan muck is like a fine, dark gray sand. Within this mass, frozen solid, lie the twisted parts of animals and trees, intermingled with lenses of ice and layers of peat and mosses. It looks as though, in the midst of some cataclysmic catastrophe of 10,000 years ago, the whole Alaskan world of living animals and plants was suddenly frozen in mid-motion. Throughout the Yukon and its tributaries, the gnawing currents of the river had eaten into many a frozen bank of muck to reveal bones and tusks of these animals protruding at all levels. Whole gravel bars in the muddy river were formed of the jumbled fragments of animal remains. The Pleistocene period ended in death. This is no ordinary extinction of a vague geological period which fizzled to an uncertain end. This death was catastrophic and all-inclusive. The large animals that had given their name to the period became extinct. Their death marked the end of an era. But how did they die? What caused the extinction of 40 million animals? This mystery forms one of the oldest detective stories in the world. A good detective story involves humans and death. These conditions are met at the end of the Pleistocene. In this particular case, the death was of such colossal proportions as to be staggering to contemplate, unquote. So the corpus delicti, is that how you say that? I don't know. The dead bodies of the deceased in this mystery may be found almost everywhere. The animals of the period wandered into every corner of the New World, not actually covered by the ice sheets. Their bones lie bleaching on the sands of Florida and in the gravels of New Jersey. They weather out of the dry terraces of Texas and protrude from the sticky ooze of the tar pits of Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. Thousands of these remains have been encountered in Mexico and even in South America. The bodies lie as articulated skeletons revealed by dust storms or as isolated bones and fragments in ditches or canals. The bodies of the victims are everywhere in evidence. It might first appear that many of these great animals died natural deaths, that is, that the remains that we find in the Pleistocene strata over the continent represent the normal death that ends the ordinary life cycle. However, where we can study these animals in some detail, such as in the great bone pits of Nebraska, we find literally thousands of these remains together. The young lie with the old, foal with the dam and calf with the cow. Whole herds of animals were apparently killed together, overcome by some common power. We have already seen that the muck pits of Alaska are filled with the evidences of universal death. Mingled in these frozen masses are the remains of many thousands of animals killed in their prime. The best evidence we could have that this Pleistocene death was not simply a case of the bison and the mammoth dying after their normal span of years is found in the Alaskan muck. In this dark gray frozen stuff is preserved quite commonly fragments of ligaments, skin, hair, and even flesh. We have gained from the muck pits of the Yukon Valley a picture of quick extinction. The evidences of violence there are as obvious as in the horror camps of Germany. Such piles of bodies of animals or men simply do not occur by any ordinary natural means. It is evident that the animals that were killed far to the south in Florida, Texas, Mexico, and South America cannot have been contained in any ice cap, whether thin or thick. Hibben suggests that other factors were at work. Quote, one of the most interesting of the theories of the Pleistocene end is that which explains this ancient tragedy by worldwide earth-shaking volcanic eruptions of catastrophic violence. This bizarre idea, queerly enough, has considerable support, especially in the Alaskan and Siberian regions. Interspersed in the muck depths and sometimes through the very piles of bones and tusks themselves are layers of volcanic ash. There is no doubt that coincidental with the end of the Pleistocene animals, at least in Alaska, there were volcanic eruptions of tremendous proportions. It stands to reason that animals whose flesh is still preserved must have been killed or buried quickly to be preserved at all. Bodies that die and lie on the surface soon disintegrate and the bones are scattered. A volcanic eruption would explain the end of the Alaskan animals all at one time, and in a manner that would satisfy the evidences there as we know them. The herds would be killed in their tracks, either by the blanket of volcanic ash covering them and causing death by heat or suffocation, or indirectly by volcanic gases. Toxic clouds of gas from volcanic upheavals could well cause death on a gigantic scale. Throughout the Alaskan mucks, too, there is evidence of atmospheric disturbances of unparalleled violence. Mammoth and bison alike were torn and twisted, as though by a cosmic hand in godly rage. In one place, we can find the foreleg and shoulder of a mammoth, with portions of the flesh and the toenails and the hair still clinging to the blackened bones. Close by is the neck and skull of a bison, with the vertebrae clinging together with tendons and ligaments, and the chitinous covering of the horns intact. There is no mark of a knife or cutting instrument. The animals were simply torn apart and scattered over the landscape like things of straw and string, even though some of them weighed several tons. Mixed with the piles of bones are trees, also twisted and torn and piled in tangled groups, and the whole is covered with fine, sifting muck and then frozen solid. God.
It's insane.
I mean, I read this multiple times thinking about this and just, were they caught in movement of water, or were they killed first and then covered?
Yeah.
Because the
shockwave can kill you.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
That's what I'm saying. They just get ripped apart, right?
Yeah.
But that should throw them everywhere. But of course, they are found everywhere. But in some cases, they're concentrated.
I was thinking about this for the concentration of like these mammoth herds. There's a couple of different ways, but one of the things I was thinking about is the buffalo in the Americas. Like it was described, like say you were out in the plains or whatever, and you're looking out when the buffalo were still roaming the area, that it just was like a blanket.
Yeah.
Moving along, right? So is it possible that some of these mammoths ran in
herds
just
of
massive,
millions of individuals? Yeah.
Yeah. And so then they get nailed by something. And I mean, it's just thousands of them or tens of thousands of them all together just being killed and then washed in this flood with trees and everything else that are coming from. So that was one idea. And then the other idea is like, and maybe you brought this up before, but you know how it's said that during a catastrophe or say a big flood or something like that, the animals will gather on an island.
Yep.
So then you get the dire wolves and you get
you get everything, predator and prey all together.
All just there in clusters, and then they just all just get
taken.
blended.
Yeah.
So a couple of scenarios there, but still just it's I don't know. It's
but I think you're right.
Sobering.
I think it's probably both. I mean, blast damage in some cases, especially if we're talking about air bursts.
Yeah.
Air burst is like maximum damage to surface, right? They found this out with a nuclear test that like detonating it on the ground did not do nearly as much surface damage. You know, like because if you do it up in the air,
you get this blast.
Yeah, and it gets to go down and boof, go out and just. It's so much more damaging to structures and to things on the ground. So all the busted, twisted trees and animals partly could be just explosions in the air, just and then the water comes from the.
Yeah, or if we're talking about something that may have been sort of like it could have played out in many ways, right? You could start out, if we're going with the impact hypothesis here, that you start getting some impacts, maybe a few things hit the ground, a few things blow up in the sky, and it's like it happens over the course of a few days, and so there's storms, there's turbulence, it's crazy, and animals are going for shelter. Then you get one big one.
Yeah.
That starts causing earthquakes and volcanism and all this stuff. And so then the floods start coming.
Yep. The water's already melted up there, and it's coming.
It's coming. Yeah. And so then you have all these animals crowding, the ones that are surviving are crowding in some safe place all together, and then something just comes and blows up over the top of them.
Right.
4 or 5 days into this thing, right? I don't know. It's like the thing that really, what's the guy's name that went on Joe Rogan? I forgot his name.
John Reeves.
Yeah. He was not mentioning archaeology, but this is what really gets me about the Clovis culture. It's like, we find all these animals and stuff in this cluster of things. Well, surely there's those guys in there too, but where are they?
Yeah, where are they?
Did they go underground with the ant people? And that's why we don't find them?
Right. Or maybe they're like Stash, and they're like, he runs under the first one. He doesn't want to survive. Right, that's what Stash says. He wants the first one to land on his head. That's what he says. There's your advice from Stash. That's your prep. Find out where the first one's going to hit and run beneath it.
Dude, he'd be at the beach fishing when the tidal wave is coming, just like, all right, I got one more.
Now I can get out past that third sandbar because the water's going out. All the fish are trapped. Yeah, that's right.
Jeez.
Well, that's the universe for you, folks. It's going to blow you up, set you on fire, throw you through the air, bury you, and freeze you forever. That's basically what it wants to do. All right, let's take a break.
All right.
And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, Brothers of the Serpent podcast, second half of the show. And I have to say, like, I've read these Hibben descriptions multiple times in preparation for the show, and we've heard some of them, pieces of them before from Randall, but they always just, I don't know, this guy was good.
I'd like to read this entire book. Some of that book. I got it on PDF and
listen to it.
I didn't make it through the whole thing, but I remember I was like early on when we had started Cosmographia, Randall was talking about it.
Yeah.
And I got it. So it's on my old phone somewhere. For those of you viewers out there, this thing, just don't pay any attention.
But yeah, these are from his book, The Lost Americans.
Yeah.
So the final quote from Hibben here says, "Storms, too, accompany volcanic disturbances of the proportions indicated here. Differences in temperature and the influence of the cubic miles of ash and pumice thrown into the air by eruptions of this sort might well produce winds and blasts of inconceivable violence. If this is the explanation of the end of all this animal life, the Pleistocene period was terminated by a very exciting time indeed," unquote. So Hapgood says, "In Chapter 9, we saw that volcanic eruptions, possibly on a great scale, are a corollary of any displacement of the crust. Therefore, our theory strongly supports and reinforces the suggestions advanced by Hibben. And at the same time, his evidence strongly supports our theory. But Hibben points out certain consequences that would flow from our theory, which I have not stressed. Wherever volcanism is very intensive, toxic gases could locally be very effective in destroying life. This is also true of violent local windstorms. Massive volcanic eruptions might, of course, occur anywhere on Earth during a movement of the crust, and we saw in Chapter 9 that they apparently occurred in a good many places, some of them far removed from the ice sheets themselves. Despite the unquestionable importance of these locally acting factors, it seems that we must give much greater importance to the meteorological results of the universally acting volcanic dust. As we have noted, this dust has a powerful effect in reducing the average temperatures of Earth's surface. A sufficient fall in temperature could easily wipe out large numbers of animals, either directly or by killing their food, or even by favoring the spread of epizootic diseases. I guess that means diseases that infect multiple different kinds of species. I'm not sure. Watcher, do you know what that is? Let me look it up. Yes, epizootic. Of relating to or denoting a disease that is temporarily prevalent and widespread in an animal population. Then the dust could greatly increase rainfall, which in certain circumstances would produce extensive floods, thus drowning numbers of animals and perhaps piling their bodies in certain spots. As already mentioned, the dust would also act to increase the temperature differences between the climatic zones, the temperature gradient, thereby increasing, perhaps very noticeably, the average wind velocities everywhere. Violent gales lasting for days at a time and recurring frequently throughout the year might raise great dust storms in which animals might be caught and killed by thirst or suffocation. It must not be forgotten that, at the same time, changes in land elevations would be in process, and these also would be affecting the climate and the availability of food supplies.
So is this a possible source for like the lust rain?
Yes.
Like if that's how it's
so much dust in the air and then it just rains out as mud.
Yeah.
So that it's interesting because, you know, there's this argument of is less water or wind deposited, and it's both. It's wind-borne dust brought down by water.
Yeah.
The gradual character of these changes would be punctuated at times by the abrupt release of accumulating tensions in the crust, accompanied by terrific earthquakes and by sudden changes of elevation locally, amounting to perhaps a good many feet, which could also be the cause of floods, either inland by the sudden damming of rivers or along the coasts. There is, as a matter of fact, as already mentioned, much evidence of turbulence throughout the world during the last North American Ice Age, not only in the air, but in the sea. It is little wonder that, faced by all these unpleasant conditions, a good many species in all parts of the world, even very far from the ice caps, gave up the struggle for existence. In conclusion, it appears to me that the whole mass of the evidence relative to the animal and plant remains in the Siberian tundra, interpreted in the light of the evidence from North America, sufficiently confirms the conclusion that there was a northward displacement of Siberia coincident with the southward displacement of North America at the end of the last North American Ice Age. All right. Chapter 11. The evidence of violent extinction in South America. In the foregoing chapters, the whole of North America and Siberia have testified to violent physical changes and to the destructive effects of unidentified forces upon a widespread animal population at the end of the Pleistocene epoch. The evidence from South America will be found as strong or even stronger. In this chapter, we shall present a number of aspects of this evidence. They include evidence of a geological revolution having to do not so much with ice caps and ice ages as with the upheaval of half of a continent in which the deaths of millions of animals resulted from extensive volcanic eruptions and vast floods. To begin with, we consider the evidence for great changes in the elevation of the high plateau of Peru and Bolivia in the very recent times. Part 1. The Lost Sea of the Andes. Outstanding among the unsolved problems of the recent geological history of South America are those connected with that part of the Cordillera where Bolivia and Peru meet. There, in the heart of the Andes at an average elevation of 12,300 feet, extends the highest lacustrine basin in the world, the Meseta or the Altiplano, on the floor of which occurs a succession of remarkable lakes. The largest of these, Lake Titicaca, is navigable, being some 110 miles long, 35 miles wide, and 890 feet deep at maximum. Its waters are only slightly brackish and support the only species of seahorse or hippocampus known to live in a landlocked body of water. Hippocampus is typically a marine creature, and with Alorchestes and a few other oceanic forms inhabiting this lake, it strongly suggests that the present fauna of Lake Titicaca has survived from a time when the lake communicated directly with the ocean. Lake Pupo. I don't know why they name these lakes these. Titicaca and Pupo. Clearly they let Sol name these lakes. Some 180 miles southeast of Titicaca and 12,051 feet above sea level, it receives its water from Lake Titicaca via the sluggish Desaguadero River. Despite the fact that it is about 50 miles long and 20 miles wide, its greatest depth is a mere 9 feet, and its water so salty that fishes reaching it from Titicaca seem unable to propagate in it. The waters of Pupo seep seasonally southward through the La Cajuera River into the shallow, marshy, and very briny Lake Coipasa, 12,031 feet above sea level, which has no outlet. This is a very uncertain extent, much of its southern portion forming a vast salt desert, some 50 miles by 35 miles in area. Still farther south is the immense salt plain of Uyuni, which at slightly over 12,000 feet above sea level is about 80 by 70 miles in area, and it is joined in the southwest by a long chain of small saltpeter and borax lakes and marshes lying on the floor of a winding valley nearly 100 miles in length, but only 5 to 8 miles wide. So he goes on to further describe more lakes and how they're all, the chemical makeup of them is interesting. So discussing the salinity of these lakes of the high plateau, Professor Arthur Poznansky of La Paz, and Poznansky did the study on Tiahuanaco. So Poznansky of La Paz observes Titicaca and Pupo, lake and salt bed of Coipasa, salt beds of Uyuni. Several of these lakes and salt beds have chemical compositions similar to those of the ocean. He pointed out that Lake Titicaca is, quote, full of characteristic saltwater mollusks, such as Paludestrina and Cyclus, which shows that it is, geologically speaking, of relatively modern origin, unquote. Hans S. Bellamy, who gave the problem of the salinity of this region very considerable thought, had the following to say. The region in which the feeders of Lake Titicaca rise consists almost exclusively of old crystalline and younger volcanic rocks. Triassic formations, from which salt is usually derived through extraction, are markedly absent.
So, just a question here about the possibility that Lake Titicaca was connected with the ocean. Couldn't you find fossil shells or something like that you could date in some way?
Yeah. You would think so, yeah.
So if it was...
He's talking about the animals that are in them.
Yeah, I'm just saying that if it was a marine, like if it was connected to the ocean, there could have been animals in there that when it rose and became disconnected and less salty, right? Is what he's saying?
I think so.
Barely mildly brackish or whatever.
Yeah.
So some of the animals must have died out.
Yeah.
It didn't evolve to be able to live in the more fresh water.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking like you should be able to find some remnants of these animals and then that don't exist in the lake, but that are in the sediments at the bottom of the lake.
Yeah.
And test that or date it in some way.
Yeah, possibly. I'm not sure that... I don't know. It seems... I couldn't figure out what they're saying here. Like the enormous amounts of salts that are in the areas that are dry.
Yeah.
Does seem like it was basically the ocean. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, you can have a freshwater lake that's almost directly connected with the ocean and the water's just brackish. There's like an exchange because water's constantly flowing down into the lake and out into the ocean.
Right.
So the ocean may end up a little salty, but it isn't necessarily like salt water.
Right.
I mean, I'm sorry, the lake may end up a little salty. So would you have, and then you get what you end up with is you get creatures that live in the lake that can live in there.
Okay, so maybe it wasn't actually marine.
It wasn't actually ocean water. Yeah. But
But
that's
he's
what I'm
saying
saying.
it
I'm
was marine
confused.
life.
Yeah, I'm confused because of the amount of salts.
Yeah, because aren't there some sharks that like swim up into these?
Yeah, they swim up the rivers.
brackish river, water in the rivers.
Yeah, and in the swamps that are nearby. Yeah.
Freaking sharks in a swamp, dude. That's like
Freaking swamp sharks, bro.
no. Okay. Anyways,
But no, it's a good question. How salty were they? And like they're saying, these
Yeah, but
vast
just
salt pans seem like.
it's just sort of an aside, but it just would be interesting to see if there are remnants down there that are saltwater creatures that have fossils left over that can be dated to a period.
Yeah.
So that you could find out, like, well, here's when it was connected to the ocean, and here's when the connection stopped, roughly.
Yeah.
That'd be cool.
And the last bit here from Bellamy, he's basically saying, look, the feeders, the accumulation area that feeds Lake Titicaca doesn't have salt in the geology. So it doesn't get its brackishness from the surrounding rock.
Right. Yeah.
So hence the presence of so much salt in the Bolivian tableland can only be accounted for by postulating a former connection of the Great Lacustrine Basin with the ocean, and by assuming the eventual evaporation of this body of water when the connection with the ocean was at last severed. The modern oceanic character of the faunas of these lakes and the chemical composition of the salt deserts support this conclusion. Additional confirmation is to be found in the recent age of the strand lines left by this ancient sea on the slopes of the mountains enclosing the Altiplano. Bellamy called this body of water the Interandean Sea. Indeed, when H.P. Moon wrote his account of the geology of the region, he put great stress on the, quote, freshness of many of the strand lines and the modern character of such fossils as occur, unquote. So the fossils they are finding are not necessarily long extinct species
modern,
either. Yeah.
Modern character.
Yeah.
Okay.
A few miles south of Lake Titicaca lies the celebrated ruin site of Tiahuanaco, a collection of shattered edifices of some ancient civilization, itself outside the present inquiry, but bearing definitely upon the radical changes which have occurred throughout the Altiplano within geologically very recent times. I was like, no, when I first read this. Outside the present inquiry. No, it's not. But of these ruins, A. Hyatt Verrill wrote, although the ruins are now over 13 miles from the lake, there are reasons to think that in the days when the city was occupied, it stood on the shores of the lake itself, or on an arm or a bay, for traces of what was apparently a dock are to be seen just north of the principal ruins. If so, the lake has receded. Bellamy refers to a canal, which appears to have surrounded the principal group of ruins at Tiahuanaco, including the structure referred to hereafter as the fortress, and adds, quote, some explorers of the site of Tiahuanaco are of the opinion that the canal was at most only a dry moat, and hence will not concede that the peculiar rectangular depressions near the ruins were once actual docks or harbor basins. But the proofs in favor of our assertion that Tiahuanaco was once a harbor town are stronger than any of the objections put forward by more superficial observers. Firstly, there is a rapid fall in level from the edge of the territory which bears culture remains to the floor of the territory which we say was covered by the waters of the Interandean Sea. The difference in level is about 35 feet north of Tiahuanaco proper. Secondly, while the soil of the territory which we say was above the water level contains numerous ceramic fragments and other remains, the former sea bottom yields practically nothing but the stone rings with which the fishermen of the time used to weight their nets. And thirdly, the dumps of roughly squared stone blocks with which the edifices at Tiahuanaco were built are found only on territory which formerly was sea bottom. Bellamy concluded from this last fact that the builders of Tiahuanaco, who obtained their material from quarries many miles distant for structures which in their skilled and accurate masonry alone may remain a mystery, floated their stone blocks in a roughly squared condition on large rafts, and that the foundering of these occasionally would leave dumps of, in effect, raw material where now found. And he made another observation of like force, quote, moreover, the dry moat must have been a water-bearing canal because the great sewer, which drained the overflow of the pond on the platform of the fortress of Acapana, discharged into it. The salient proof, and one wholly relevant in present review, that Tiahuanaco possessed a waterfront rests upon discernible traces of alkaline incrustations on the sides of the huge stone blocks forming a part of the above described mole, harbor basin, or canal wall. The line of these incrustations corresponds closely with that of the strand line on the slopes of the surrounding mountains, about which Bellamy wrote. It was carefully surveyed for a length of about 375 miles. And then it was established that it was not straight. It was found that the Inter-Andean Sea was not merely a Lake Titicaca of higher level extending far to the south, but that its level showed a slant of a most peculiar character in relation to the present ocean level, or, which amounts to the same, relative to the present level of Lake Titicaca. The level of the Inter-Andean Sea, revealed by the ancient strand line, was higher to the north of Tiahuanaco and lower to the south. The actuality of this peculiarity cannot be doubted, for it was established independently by different persons at different times using different methods of surveying. The northernmost point at which the former strand line of the Inter-Andean Sea has been surveyed is on the mountain slopes near Silistani and to the west of Lake Umayo in the Peruvian department of Puno. So the Silistani is where those weird towers are.
The Cholpas? Or
Yeah.
whatever? Yeah.
So this makes it seem like those were basically on the ridges above the water.
Wow, that's cool. So they could have been like lighthouse type things.
Something like that.
So they're burnt. Maybe they burn a fire up, and then in the dark, people know where the bank is. Or something.
I don't know, but yeah, they're like signal towers or something
cool.
along the water line.
Oh, crap, that's awesome. We got to go there.
Yeah.
The Watcher says, there is indeed a variation of freshwater sea horses that live in Lake Titicaca. They look identical to the saltwater kind physically, but are medium green in color. They are one of the wonders of biology.
Only ones in existence.
The only ones in existence, yeah.
Only known freshwater version of that, yeah. So, near Silistani to the west of Lake Umayo in the Peruvian district of Puno, there, the former littoral or strand line is about 295 feet above the present level of Lake Titicaca, whose surface is 12,506 feet above sea level. At Tiahuanaco, at the southern end of Lake Titicaca, the same strand line is only 90 feet above the level of that great sheet of water and 4 feet below the coping stones of the parapets of the long dry harbors and docks and canals of that mysterious metropolis. The ancient strand line and the ruined prehistoric city are linked beyond any doubt. So you see that?
That's crazy, man.
That cool. Paints a cool picture that way up there where the Silistani is, it's almost 300 feet, the strand line, almost 300 feet above the present surface of the lake. Where Tiahuanaco is at the southern end of the lake, the other side, it's only 90 feet above the present surface of the lake, but 4 feet below the coping stones of the city itself. I mean, basically it says that the city was, the lowest blocks are right there at the water line.
4 feet above the water line. And the whole thing is tilted.
Yes. It's sloping downwards from the north towards Lake to the south into the The height
is the city tilted?
It's so destroyed, it's hard to tell. But yeah, I would imagine.
But yeah, and it's probably because he was saying however many miles they were checking.
375 miles it was surveyed.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, it's got a tilt, but it's not much.
Yeah.
Yeah. The height of the strand line relative to the ocean level decreases the further south we go. At the northern end of Lake Pupo, on the mountain slopes south of Oruro, it is 12,232 feet above sea level, or 181 feet above the level of Lake Pupo, or 274 feet below the level of Lake Titicaca, or 364 feet below the level of the same ancient strand line in the latitude of Tiahuanaco.
I'm not getting it.
Okay. So over by the other lake, Pupo, where they're checking the same strand line.
Okay. All right.
So way farther to the south, it's 274 feet below the current level of Lake Titicaca, whereas
okay, got it. Because
the strand line at Tiahuanaco is 90 feet above the current level, and up there at Silistani was almost 300 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that strand line. So wow.
Still further south, it is discernible.
So those lakes were all connected by this sea.
The lakes
giants.
are like remnant puddles.
Okay, that's what I didn't get.
Still further south, it is discernible just a few feet above the level of Lake Coipasa, and then it becomes lost in the salt desert of Uyuni, some 12,300 feet above sea level. So from Silistani to beyond Lake Coipasa, a distance of about 375 miles, the strand line dips 800 feet. So in 375 miles, it falls 800 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's probably not a discernible tilt, but it's definitely tilted. I mean, I guess if you could stand and look at a line of mountains, you might notice, and you're looking, and you have the lake there to give you a level.
Yeah.
You might see like it's lower over there and it gets higher that way, but otherwise you wouldn't notice.
I don't know if you'd notice 800 feet in a mountain chain. I mean,
yeah, but you might notice 300 feet, a 300-foot drop along the area of Lake Titicaca itself.
Yeah.
If you could see that side and then towards this side as you're looking out across the lake on distant.
I mean, it sounds like they didn't notice it until they surveyed it.
Right, they had to survey it. Yeah, you probably wouldn't notice. I don't think the strand line is super visible in most places.
Yeah.
In some places, it is distinct.
The fact that it's 12,000 feet above sea level.
That makes it a huge mystery.
That's crazy.
It's like it shows all signs of having been connected with the ocean, but it is the highest lake, in one of the highest lakes in the world, you know.
That was connected with the ocean at some point. So
that's what I'm saying.
It's just
but now it's like one of the highest elevation lakes in the world.
Yeah. But Atlantis could not sink. There's no way, bro.
A peculiarity of the dip is that it seems to be progressive. In the first quarter of the distance, it's only about 1.25 feet per mile. But in the last fourth, it increases to more than 2 feet per mile. So it's actually curves down.
Curve.
Yeah. The strand line is very distinct. It consists not only of notches cut into the rock by the prolonged action of shore waves and of fan-like delta deposits of mud and gravel which former streams dropped upon meeting the ancient water's edge.
God. I want to see this. I want to go dig around there.
But chiefly of conspicuous deposits of white lime of a thickness of many feet upon the red sandstone or brown porphyry and amorphous slate or gray granite and andesite. This white streak, which is drawn along the slopes of the mountain chains surrounding the Altiplano and visible on the islands of Lake Titicaca like a chalk line, is the residue of certain calcareous algae, chiefly of Alga calcarea. This lowly organized plant, which contains about 80% of lime, is still found growing in certain shallow shore parts of Lake Titicaca. It only thrives in slightly muddy water down to a depth not exceeding 3 feet. The phenomenon of this slanting strand line is generally thought to be due to an imbalanced rise of South America out of the waters of the ocean. These forces, it has been argued, lifted the continent to a greater height in the north than in the south, thus explaining why the level of the former Interandean Sea is not parallel with that of either Lake Titicaca or the present ocean. So you can see there that he's basically saying it's in general basically accepted that this lake rose from but they can't accept that Tiahuanaco was associated with the original sea.
Yeah.
Because they probably think that this happened millions of years ago.
Yeah. And over millions of years or whatever.
Right.
Because they would think the rise is gradual.
Yeah.
So, and there was a part in there about how some of the lowest stones or whatever have like crustacean, like barnacles.
Yeah. That the strand line of the original ocean corresponds directly with 4 feet below the level of these stones of the city.
Wasn't there a part where they were saying there was like basically...
Oh, barnacles encrusted on the blocks themselves?
Wasn't there something like that back there? I don't know, man.
I don't remember that.
They didn't say
says,
barnacles. It
no.
said something about crust. Like, I thought it was like
it says at Tiahuanaco at the southern end of the lake, the same strand line is 90 feet above the level of that great sheet of water, in other words, the current lake. 4 feet below the coping stones of the parapets of the long, dry harbors and docks and canals of that mysterious metropolis, the ancient strand line and the ruined prehistoric city are linked beyond any doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So even if there's not necessarily any direct evidence, that fact that the ancient strand line goes right through the level of the city itself just seems, it just seems... And then there's, they're like, well, it was a dry moat.
Yeah,
that they just happened to build like right above the ancient strand line that they probably didn't know was there.
Just 4 feet below.
It's coincidence, man. But
maybe their engineers were like, hey, look, obviously the lake rises to this point, so this is above the 100-year flood zone.
That's right.
Guys.
They're like, this is 12 miles from the water. Well, this is clearly where the lake has been before. You don't want to put the city down there. It'll go underwater at some point.
And then the cholpas are all near the strand line.
Right.
Like
at the upper end.
Come on.
And they have
Dude. We gotta go there.
I mean, I was saying maybe it's not distinct, but this description seems like it's super visible. You've got
that's what it said.
Dark red sandstone, brown porphyry, and amorphous
you have that
slate,
white
and then there's just this white line
from the.
It's obvious.
Yeah. Really cool.
On the basis of paleontological and hydrological evidence, Bellamy believed that in geologically recent time, the whole Cordillera was violently upheaved and the Interandean Sea thereby caused to vanish, the remnants of which have, over long periods of time, shrunk to their present vestigial conditions. Remarkable confirmation of the immensity of this uplift is represented by the ancient agricultural stone terraces surrounding the Titicaca Basin. These structures, belonging to some bygone civilization, occur at altitudes far too high to support the growth of crops for which they were originally built. Some rise to 1,500 feet above sea level, or about 2,500 feet above the ruins of Tiahuanaco. And on Mount Illimani, they occur up to 18,400 feet above sea level, which is above the line of current eternal snow. We've talked about this a long time ago, how it's like these terraces go up into the permanent ice. Yeah. And who's growing crops at 15,000 feet? You can't even grow crops at the level of Titicaca right now.
Yeah.
Most crops. I mean, some stuff would grow, but it would be grasses, like there's certain grasses that can grow, but you can't. Are you going to be able to grow enough food to support a massive population for a big city? I don't know. I just find all this fascinating.
Yeah, me too.
18,400 feet above sea level. I mean, don't you need oxygen to be up there? Poznansky, who described these terraces as practically endless, concluded that the entire Altiplano region was formerly at a much lower level than at present. It is clear, however, that other areas of the Cordillera underwent profound changes also. Dr. E. Huntington noted from aerial survey photographs of arid and desert regions in Peru an unexpected number of old ruins and an almost incredible number of terraces for cultivation, showing how some ancient race had cultivated formerly fertile tracts which are now absolutely desiccated.
Wow.
I've seen that. I've cruised over a lot of these areas with Google Earth, and you can see terracing out in the middle of places where nothing grows.
Yeah.
It's just gray, and there's terrace lines all along the ridges, along the edges of these valleys. And they go for hundreds of miles of this stuff. And then out in the middle of nowhere, there's whole grid lines of something,
Yeah. The fact that you would terrace all that stuff also suggests that the valleys were either they filled the valleys and their population grew to the point that they needed to terrace.
Yeah.
Or the valleys weren't reliable for farming, like if they were just flooding constantly or
Right.
some, some other reason.
It also seems like there were a lot of people.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The population was big enough to where they'd already filled all the valleys with the farming and
Well,
like,
and the sheer number of terraced farmlands.
Yeah.
And what are you doing with all this surplus food if you only have 20,000 people? You got hundreds of miles of terraces.
Yeah. It's crazy, dude.
All right.
Yeah.
I think that's it for this week. I tell you what, this has been my favorite part of this book so far.
Yeah. It's great. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back, folks. Fastest 2 hours in podcasting, ladies and gentlemen. Might as well.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's it for, what is this, part 9?
Part 9.
Of Path of the Pole for today, and on to the intro, where we warm you up for the long discussion ahead.
All you skippers can leave.
Constantly evolving here on Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
Also, and thank you for the Cepha. We got the Cepha.
I don't know. She said it was a vape pen holder. That stays. It's pretty cool looking.
Yeah. Yeah, so now that Kyle has completely cleared the studio of all knickknacks and
It's time for all of you to send us stuff to
clearly
fill it up
Ann
with
thinks
again.
that it's too empty. It needs little things sitting on places.
Yeah.
Now that it's cleaned out.
Russ still loves you, Ann. He's just being grumpy right now. So we're gonna do some emails. I got a couple of news stories. You want me to start with those?
Well, I mean, we got Space Weather News. We got
Oh yeah, that's right.
Ag. What are you doing? You're going to a symposium?
I'm going to a wine symposium.
Yeah.
Which is like sort of just like a industry convention deal.
Is it a convention or are you taking classes?
Well, it's like they have, it's like classes, but it's not. I don't know. It's not really like that. People are giving presentations.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a lot of wine tasting. All the people from the industry in the hill country will be there. There will be a lot of vendors there. It's just like a big sort of,
yeah.
I don't know, you call it a convention? It's a symposium.
Yeah.
I suppose. I've been 2 or 3 times, maybe 2. But it's cool. I learn a lot of stuff. Get to meet people, meet vendors, hang out, drink wine with them.
Schmoozing.
Learn how they party.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely some partying involved. So.
Wine tasting.
And wine tasting at 11 in the morning. So yeah, but it's gonna be good. I mean, it's always fun and entertaining and educational. So,
and we worked on the white wine on Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do I want to go into details about that?
No,
Not really.
let's just say we might have some problems there.
Yeah. Not happy about it. But anyway, it's probably going to be okay. I'm going to get it tested tomorrow. And so, when you're doing custom crush and you got your wine at far away, it's hard to get there every day. We've got wine locally. We've got duties at the vineyard. And, if you got to drive for an hour to go check on one tank, sometimes you neglect it for a while, which is basically what happened. So I'm hoping it's going to be all right. I think it's going to be all right.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. I'll go back to putting numbers on polls. That's what I've been doing.
The path of the polls.
The path of the pole. I've been affixing metallic numerals to the ends of the
trellis
posts. Yeah. So that's what I've been doing.
All right, that thing's working now. Cool.
So that Kyle, when he's spraying, can see where he's at in the vineyard through the tractor windows, which are usually covered in stuff.
Yeah, when you're spraying, some of the sprays are they're like chalky.
Yeah.
And they just coat the entire tractor, and I have a windshield wiper in the front and in the back. But the side windows are complete. You just cannot see through them. And a lot of times I do it at night.
Yeah.
Most of the time, if I got to do the whole thing, there's a lot of it happening at night.
Yeah, it's too windy during the day usually.
It's too windy, and then plus certain things you don't want to spray when the bees are out.
Yep.
So, anyway, it's really hard to see where you are. You go out, you leave a row, and then you turn around, and the tractor has this turn radius, and you look behind you, and you're like, okay, I'm on the row that has that weird looking vine there. And then you turn around
and you're lost.
And when you're sideways, you can't see out the side window. So you can't keep your eye on wherever you were. And you turn back around and you're like, all rows look the same.
Yeah.
So you got to have numbers visible, very, well visible at night.
Yeah.
So yeah. Let's see. The Watcher says a convention, in the sense of a meeting, is a gathering of individuals who meet at an arranged place and time in order to discuss or engage in some common interest. The most common conventions are based upon industry, profession, and fandom. So,
thanks, Watcher.
It's a convention. Thanks, bro. What else?
I don't know. Let's do space weather.
Okay.
From spaceweather.com, geomagnetic storm. A minor G1 class geomagnetic storm is in progress on January 15th as Earth passes through the magnetized wake of a stealthy CME, which arrived almost 2 days ago. The CME was embedded inside a co-moving solar wind stream, hiding some of its usual signatures. Arctic skywatchers should be alert for auroras. And a twist of dark plasma left the sun on January 14th, propelled by a double dip M4 class solar flare in the magnetic canopy of sunspot AR3182. The debris carved a spiraling path through the sun's atmosphere, a blender-like process that hurled a coronal mass ejection into space.
Yes.
Nature loves blenders. NOAA analysts say that the CME could deliver a glancing blow to Earth's magnetic field on January 19th. Current conditions, solar wind speed is pretty high, 519 kilometers per second, and the density is very high, 16.88 protons per cubic centimeter. So high speed, high density solar wind. Current sunspot number is 177. The neutron count is only 3.3% above the space age average. And the KP index is 4, which is unsettled, and the 24-hour max is at 5, which is rated as stormy. So there you go. Space weather news for the week.
All right.
Crypto. Bitcoin up $21,122.09. And Ethereum at holding steady, I think, at 1571.21. Ring the Ceph.
It's the new bell because I keep forgetting to get it. All right. Phys.org. New results reveal surprising behavior of minerals deep in the earth. As you are reading this, more than 400 miles below you is a massive world of extreme temperatures and pressures that has been churning and evolving for longer than humans have been on the planet. Now, a detailed new model from Caltech researchers illustrates the surprising behavior of minerals deep in the planet's interior over millions of years and shows that the processes are actually happening in a manner completely opposite to what had been previously theorized. That's all I'm going to read. If you want to know about this process, go to phys.org. The point is made. This is a lighthearted...
Completely opposite.
Yeah, from what was previously theorized. It's just, I'm just making a point, folks. This is from Ancient Origins. This is a lighthearted story. I think it's pretty cool. The lost Egyptian origins of the superstitious numbers 13 and 18. The superstitious numbers 13 and 18 both have a long history reaching back millennia. The first is usually regarded as unlucky, the latter lucky. But why? What are the actual origins of these unusual numbers, and why do they carry such diverse connotations? Let us delve into the ancient beginnings of these magical numbers and discover their real royal pedigrees. Any ideas why 13 is an unlucky number?
No.
Yeah, I didn't either.
I mean, I know that I thought Friday the 13th was somehow associated with the downfall of the Templars.
Yep, you got that one.
Okay.
That's
I don't know the 18 though.
Well, that's at least one aspect of the unlucky number 13.
Yeah.
So, and I remember that from when we talked about the sign and the seal.
Yeah. Yeah, that
show number watcher.
The letter went out and got them all to do the same thing on this specific day, right? That was what it was?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And they were slaughtered, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, so when 13 falls on a Friday, millions of people around the world are genuinely fearful. Most buildings skip the 13th floor, and nobody wants to be the 13th guest invited to a dinner, lest they die before the year is finished, Russ.
I've never heard that.
This is due in large part to Christian influence in the Western world. According to the Gospels, Judas Iscariot was the 13th guest at the Last Supper, the guest who ultimately betrayed his master. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of the Knights Templars, most of whom ultimately died. Christianity also downplayed the importance of this number because of its association with pagan religion. For example, there should be 13 witches in a coven, etc. What's a coven?
A coven.
Coven.
A coven of witches.
What's a coven? It's a bunch of witches.
A group of witches. A circle of darkness.
Coven. Interestingly, there is a Norse story in which the god Loki was 13th to arrive at the feast in Valhalla, where he tricked another attendee into killing the god Balder.
Of course, yes.
Remember that one? We went over that.
And Balder
story.
was invincible. So there was some specific trick that Loki pulled.
That was such an interesting story.
Yeah.
We were drawing all kinds of parallels with that story.
Yeah.
On some show. I don't remember which number that one is. Sign and the Seal Part 1 is episode 92, by the way. That was a great little series. Not a book report. We just talked about it.
Yeah.
13 is also the death card in the tarot deck, which, the tarot is said to have originated from Egyptian mythology and symbolism. But far from a negative sign, the card usually means a major change in a person's life. Quote, "It is uncommon that this card actually represents a physical death. Rather, it typically implies an end, possibly of a relationship or interest, and therefore an increased sense of self-awareness." End quote. That's Eden Gray, The Complete Guide to the Tarot, 1970. According to numerologists, the number 13 is considered to be very karmic, associated with the divine, and is believed to bring good luck and prosperity to those who embrace it. In fact, many people believe that the number 13 brings about change, which can often lead to a positive outlook. I agree with that. A good example of this is Taylor Swift, who is arguably the most successful female music artist in history. 13 is her lucky number. She says, I was born on the 13th. I turned 13 on Friday the 13th. My first album went gold in 13 weeks. My first #1 song had a 13-second intro. Watcher, did you know all this? Store that in your list of
Watcher
pop culture references.
bullshit.
The new beginnings of 13. The idea of 13 being a number of change, of transformation, seems to come from its place following 12, which has long been seen in ancient cultures as representing completeness, perfection, entirety, and even cosmic order. There are 2 12-hour periods in a day, 12 lunar months in the solar year, 12 Olympian gods, 12 labors of Hercules, 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples of Jesus, and even the 12 days of Christmas. However, hiding behind the so-called complete number 12 is the number representing uncompleteness, or something new, something just beginning, 13.
Do not count 13. That is too far.
The concept of new beginnings associated with 13 is also prevalent in Judaism, which doesn't see 13 as an unlucky number, but rather as an important number representing new beginnings and luck. Jewish children become full adults at age 13. Damn. You can drink at 13 if you're Jewish. Responsible for obeying all Jewish laws. That was the end of the sentence. They had So
Full
they're
adults,
13, full adults,
responsible for obeying all the laws.
Okay, you can also get arrested at 13. I didn't think about that. When Israel was established in 1948, its first provisional government had 13 members because its founders said they needed all the luck they could get. Further important Jewish uses of this number include the 13 attributes of, I'm going to butcher this, but Hashem, or mercy, the 13 Jewish principles of faith according to Maimonides, and the number of days of festivals in a year in the diaspora. Also, Adar the second is considered extra lucky because of the month of Adar, according to tradition, is a lucky month, which is, I guess it's the 13th month in a leap year. Luck and new life in Egypt. 13 was also considered lucky in Egypt, according to Kathy Padden. She says, the ancient Egyptians believed life was a spiritual journey that unfolded in stages. They believed that 12 of those stages occurred in this life, but the last, the 13th, was a joyous, transformative ascension to an eternal afterlife. So the number 13 represented death to the Egyptians, but not death as in decay and fear, but as acknowledgement of a glorious eternal life. In Egyptian mythology, the deceased soul had to pass through 12 gates in the afterlife before it could arrive at the 13th realm, that of Osiris, ruler of the afterlife, and Egypt's first mythic pharaoh. Here the soul was judged before Osiris and the 42 gods, and the heart judged before Osiris and the 42 gods, and the heart was weighed against the feather of truth.
Right. The 13th place is where they give you the impossible test.
Weighing your heart against a feather.
Right. No one passes.
So no one stands at the right hand of Osiris? Are you serious? Mark Oliver from Ancient Origins explains what happened to a pure soul. Quote, I guess this does happen. The innocent were reunited with the part of the soul left behind in the body. They would be granted eternal life and passage into paradise, where they would live with the gods in a land where the fields grew in an endless abundance. The number 13 is thus associated with Osiris and the resurrection of the dead, just like the death card, ironically. Not really, because it's based on this stuff, I guess. Osiris first appears in the pyramid text, mortuary inscriptions from the Old Kingdom's 5th dynasty, which is from 2465 to 2325 BC. Osiris appears as the first pharaoh of Egypt and the first king to be resurrected from the dead to live eternally. And in the Osiris myth, Set kills his brother, the king, and cuts his body into 14 pieces, which he scatters across Egypt. His sister Isis hunts far and wide and ultimately finds 13 of the grisly pieces. Sadly, she never ends up finding the last piece, the penis, which is eaten by a fish in the Nile. She decides to sever her own thumb and use as a phallus for her brother, and binds together his pieces using linen wrappings, creating the world's first mummy. After reciting magical spells, Osiris is magically resurrected, becoming the archetype of all future resurrections. He ultimately becomes god of the Duat, judge of the dead and lord of the afterlife. Additionally, Isis takes the form of a bird and impregnates herself on Osiris, creating Horus, who ultimately avenges his father and kills his uncle. Osiris was the god with which pharaohs fused when they died, to live eternally both in the stars and the fields of Aru. For example, in the Osiris complex of the Medinet Habu mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Luxor, we see an image of the pharaoh as Osiris in the afterlife holding the crook and flail, demonstrating his revival and coronation in the realm of Osiris, chief of the Westerners and ruler of eternity, the god par excellence of the dead. Thus, 13 is a number steeped in ancient myth, representing the resurrection of Osiris, his realm of eternity, reached by the pure soul after 12 gates or hours of darkness and demons, and ultimately of personal transformation. So, goes way back.
So is it lucky or unlucky?
I don't know. It's. I guess it.
I guess that
the association with death and transformation is scary.
Yeah.
So can be both.
Then it kind of at the beginning, it was saying that the idea of 13 as an unlucky number is Christian influence, whereas if you go back farther and look at other places, it's a lucky number. Beer 3?
Beer number 3, folks. All right. Esoteric 18. Should I keep going?
Yeah. I like it.
All right. The number 18 has long been famously lucky
I had no
in
idea.
Judaism.
Oh,
you didn't
okay.
know this?
No.
Donations are often given in its multiples, such as 36 and 72, as an expression of blessing for long life. The reason usually given for this luckiness is that the Hebrew word for life, chai, I guess, I don't know the pronunciation, has a numerical value of 18, as all words in Hebrew also have a numerical equivalent. Thus, gifts and money are given in multiples of 18 because Jews believe it encourages long life. The main prayer of the Jewish liturgy is called the Shemone Esri, or Ezrai, which means 18, and is recited by observant Jews thrice daily. It dates back at least 2,000 years and recounts 18 requests for God, such as asking God to help grant wisdom and understanding. It is also known as the Amidah, and today includes a final 19th blessing, asking God for peace, goodness, blessings, kindness, and compassion. We thus know 18 has been a popular number in Judaism for expressing a wish for a long life. The question remains, why? The word chai, or life, likely derives from the ancient Egyptian word hai, or H-A-I, I don't know how to pronounce these words, which translates as rejoicing. For example, the famous pharaoh Amenhotep III built himself a palace on the West Bank at Thebes and called it the Per Hai, or the House of Rejoicing. There must have been great jubilation and excitement in this illustrious palace, which has been partially excavated, according to Ariel P. Kozloff. Quote, "The name was no understatement, judging from the superabundant potsherd gift labels found there, many inscribed with year dates." End quote. The Prince of Egypt and the soon-to-be monotheistic pharaoh Akhenaten eventually built his own Per Hai at his new city of Aten, which is modern Amarna. 18 to life. This evidence is further supported by a peculiar fascination of these pharaohs with the Ankh, the well-known symbol of life in ancient Egypt. This was especially loved by Akhenaten, who constantly depicted himself being given the gift of life by his sole god, the Aten sun disk. I didn't know Akhenaten depicted himself. Was he the one doing all that? He carved all those stones of himself?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just splitting hairs here with this guy.
Well, did he build that city?
Yeah,
They always say.
okay.
Yeah.
This one guy built this city.
Yeah.
See, life to these pharaohs was all important, and numerous hieroglyphic inscriptions grant a long life to Pharaoh in a very Jewish sense. Quote, "Long live the good God, who is pleased with truth, Lord of all the Aten in circles, Lord of heaven, Lord of earth, and the great living Aten, who illuminates the two banks. Long live the Father, the Aten, given life forever, continually, great living Aten," which is an inscription from the tomb of Ai, the 25th in Amarna. The author has written previously that Akhenaten was intent on becoming a new Osiris. Akhenaten upended centuries of tradition in all areas of Egyptian life and depicted himself as a new Osiris, an Osiris of the day, personally offering his people Sebet, Mat, and Ankh, the way, the truth, and the life. Contrary to Osiris being the source of all new growth under his new paradigm, and according to Amarna inscriptions, this quality had been transferred to the Aten. We read in the great hymn to the Aten from the tomb of Ai, the king's general. "You, Aten, who rise and make all creation grow for the king, you, Aten, make the inundation from the underworld. As for all distant countries, you make their life. How functional are your plans, O Lord of Continuity." Lord of Continuity was a title of Osiris, by the way. If Akhenaten, who envisioned himself as a new Osiris, lived on to become Moses, as this author has argued, we can better understand his emphasis on long life, one living God, and rejoicing, all aspects of the famous lawgiver. For example, Akhenaten was often described in contemporary texts as promulgating a moral, ethical, commandment-based teaching of life, nearly identical to the Torah of Moses. "How prosperous is he," this is a quote, "how prosperous is he who hears your teaching of life, for he will be fulfilled." And that came out of the tomb of Ai as well. I didn't know this guy. I guess I didn't read this part, but I'd be interested to see how he's making this case that Akhenaten may actually have been Moses.
Yeah.
That's
It sounds familiar. I think I've read some of that
like
before.
this?
Yeah.
Torah, meanwhile, has been described as a teaching for all life, and using remarkably Amarna-esque language. Quote, "The goal of Jewish life is to embody Torah, the living word of the living God, addressed to all creation through the life and experience of Am Yisrael, the Jewish people." I don't know. 18 enemies of Egypt. The number 18 represented Egypt's enemies, at least in an allegorical sense. The first line of the famous Merneptah stele reads, "Year 5, 3rd month of the 3rd season, 3rd day, under the majesty of Horus, mighty bull rejoicing in the truth, king of Upper and Lower Egypt."
Was that Merenptah?
Yeah, Merenptah. That's what it is. Merenptah. Mighty bull, smiter of the 9 bows, whose name is given forever and ever. End quote. Likewise, the Sphinx stele of Amenhotep II provides a striking textual description of Pharaoh smiting his enemies. Quote, "He bound the heads of the 9 bows or bows. He has gathered them all into his fist. His mace has crashed upon their heads." According to Jimmy Dunn, the figure 9 represented 3 times 3, which was the plurality of pluralities, thus designating the entirety of all enemies. This is curiously echoed in the Psalms of the Old Testament. For example, Psalm 110 reads, or 110:1 reads, "Until I make your enemies your footstool." Amazingly, a footstool with depictions of these enemies was found by Carter in the tomb of Tutankhamun. This guy. Also found within the famous tomb were sandals with depictions of 9 bows, B-O-W-S, bows or bows?
Bows, I think is right, yeah.
9 bows on each foot, making a total of 18 enemies of Pharaoh. 8 bows were drawn in the sandals, while the strap represented the 9th and the final bow.
So C-H-A-I, usually pronounced like the English word high. A word and symbol that means life.
Okay. Hi. That's interesting. We say hi to each other. Life.
Where's that button?
Life. What's even more surprising is the depiction of bound enemies on more than one pair of sandals, included with King Tut's tomb. The inner soles of a pair of elaborate marquetry veneer sandals depicts an African prisoner on one sandal and an Asiatic prisoner on the other, representing the enemies of King Tut's kingdom. Taking into account that artistic representations were used to manifest reality in ancient Egypt, the message was quite clear. Every time the pharaoh took a step, he would have literally been stepping on the faces of his enemies. Wow.
God.
Tutankhamun literally walked on his 18 enemies daily, reminding the world that Pharaoh, despite his youth, ruled all. So then he goes on, 18 in art and architecture. Let's see how much more we got here. Okay, it's not much more. Let's see where he's going with this. Ever since the Old Kingdom, almost 5,000 years ago, the human figure has been depicted in art using grid squares. For example, when a wall was about to be painted, the artist began by covering the wall with a grid, enabling them to copy faithfully from a design drawn up on a papyrus. Then they traced the outline of the figures in red paint. Human figures had a standard number of squares. We've seen this in the tombs. This happened to be 18 grid squares from foot to eye level, thus allowing for any sized headdress. 18 was thus the magic number to depict all gods and people in the Egyptian art canon for thousands of years. Upon what were these 18 squares based? Well, it was the human palm, or 4 fingers. The famous royal cubit was equal to 7 palms, or just under 21 inches. These 18 squares were divided into 11 squares from feet to waist. In parentheses, he says actually 11.1 from feet to navel, very important to the Egyptians, and 7 squares from waist to eye level. They are also in a golden ratio with each other. 18, 11.1 is an excellent 18. What is it? A colon 11.1 is an excellent approximation of phi. 2 quantities are in the golden ratio if their ratio is the same as the ratio of their sum to the larger of the 2 quantities. 1.618. It has long been recognized in geometry and nature and has been used in art due to its aesthetic pleasantness. Looking deeper, researcher Christopher Bartlett believes these numbers are present within the dimensions of the Great Pyramid itself. For example, its base to height ratio is 11 to 7, exactly the same ratio as the human body. There are further examples of this ratio within the massive structure. I don't know how he's going off on phi now. Where's 18? Rudolf Gantenbrink, using his small robot, Upaut, discovered in 1997 several 14 to 11 and 11 to 7 proportions in the interior measures and in the horizontal exit points of the pyramid shafts. For example, they are placed at 14 to 11 division of the vertical height, creating an angle of 51.843 degrees, the same as the side of the pyramid. Further, the shafts meet at a point at the base of the king's chamber that is 11 to 18 of the horizontal distance between the outer openings of the 2 shafts. Bartlett notes that previous studies, such as Badaway's 1965, have identified evidence of this simple golden ratio proportion applied to at least 55 Egyptian temples. Meanwhile, R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz demonstrates in his 1998 book, The Temple of Man, that Luxor Temple utilized the golden ratio and the aesthetic proportions of the human figure, and its architectural plan corresponded to vital anatomical parts of the body, such as the navel corresponding to the peristyle sun court of Amenhotep III. Thus, 18 is perhaps the most important number in defining the proportions of people and gods, and even the grandest pyramids from 5,000 years ago, as well as a long life well lived. 13, meanwhile, challenges us to accept new things in life, to become like Osiris and transform ourselves with divine help. The next time you see a 13 or an 18, consider it lucky. You are syncing with a special secret symbolism that stretches back millennia and tapping into the same sacred numbers that built the pyramids, the same symmetry that defined ancient art and beauty, and the same powers of resurrection harnessed by the very gods and pharaohs of Egypt. So, there you go.
All right.
Emails? We're out
done.
of time.
Yeah.
Well, that was a long story, folks. I guess.
No, that was good. I liked the 13 part.
Yeah.
18 lost me a bit there, but it got back into the,
Yeah, I think after I read the 13, I was like, this is a good story. I'll just bookmark it.
Yeah. No, it was good. I love Ancient Origins. They usually have really good articles, so. Okay,
I barely even started this third beer.
Yeah.
That's unlucky. It's not complete.
Well, we do have emails, but we'll just have to get to them on the next episode.
Yeah, no big deal.
We got plenty of episodes to go. So.
Yep. Well.
Yeah. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for all the support.
Yep. Pleasure being here.
Yep.
Love doing it. And it's amazing that you guys love it as well.
Yeah.
It's a humbling thing.
It is.
Right, Watcher? He knows I'm right.
He does.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, guys. Yep. I think that's it. Check the website for podcast related stuff.
Yep.
You guys know all the things. We love you. We
Always
do.
have.
Always will.
Good night, Adamu.
Get back to work.